right. So yeah, this next session, first and foremost, great to have you with us, David. Just to introduce this next segment, it's really focusing a lot more towards youth mental health, right? I think it's been a big topic in Singapore and the region and the world as well. Youth today are exposed to a lot of different things, from social media towards different forms of new things happening in the world, how we live, how we work as well. And we have the honor of having David Chua, the Chief Executive Officer of the National Youth Council of Singapore, as well as the chairman of SCAPE. For those based in Singapore, I'm sure you guys know NYC does a lot of work for the youths here. And I must share that just in my interactions with David, him leading NYC really does a big difference, because he sees it not just from I'll say from a landscape level, but a lot more into data and how actually as an individual he relates towards the youth mental health as well. So I'm really glad and honored to have David on board. I'm just going to pause the screen share and have the either. All right. Hey, David, thank you so much for joining us on the session today.
Hi, Theo. Thanks for having me. And hi, everyone.
Good to have you here. So today's session, it's quite an interesting one that hits home, I think, to you and what you oversee as well, youth mental health. So I think this segment, we're going to cover a few things, right, on how actually currently you see mental health for youth, how NYC sees mental health for youth, and I think some of your own personal stories and things that you like to share about how, as a general community and as individuals, we can actually tackle mental health for whether if we're youth ourselves. And I think you can also feel free to add on a bit more to define what youth stands for. It's quite a broad segment. It's not just teenagers, but actually applies towards a lot of the working adults as well there. So I'm just going to kick it off firstly. David, I'll pass it to you if you don't mind just giving a quick introduction of yourself, your work, and what you do, building off what I just shared as well.
Happy to do that. So the National Youth Council has been around for 6 years in its current structure. We left the People's Association sometime in 2015, and the sole reason was to take a broader and holistic view to youth development on different dimensions, and one of them being socio-emotional health, which will include mental well-being. But to be perfectly honest, the focus on mental well-being didn't really quite take off in the early days until we started noticing more acute attention and voices from young people about 2 to 3 years ago. And around 2018, the voices became a lot stronger about a need in this area. And to be perfectly candid as well, we're not the expert caregivers in this area. And so it was equally daunting, and I would say to a certain extent puzzling for us. And this was more the purview of healthcare and even the Ministry of Social and Family. And for us to actually go into the space, we had to deal with professionals, we had to dig deeper into the data. And I wouldn't say that we are experts still at this stage, but maybe we do bring a slightly different perspective to the clinical lens. And here's where I hope that my sharing will just give some insight into this other perspective. Just a bit more about the National Youth Council, though. So we look into growth opportunities for young people. While we look at the age band of 15 to 35, and I say it with a bit of a smile, because the 35-year-old obviously may not consider himself or herself as a youth, but that's our age mandate. But we do focus a little more on the 15 to 25 portion, not 35. And with a higher attention on the 19 to 24 age range, because of the potential for formation, identity formation, character building, and perspective shaping. So when we think about growth opportunities, we think about opportunities to engage young people, for them to be heard, for them to be civically active, for them to undergo experiences that allow them to be exposed and to challenge themselves. So that comes not just from us, actually it comes a lot from partners, and they will include some of you out there in the audience. We can't curate all the growth opportunities and exposure opportunities for young people, but collectively, we could. And so that's where we come in to provide the support and the resource to give a plethora of growth opportunities. And that's our mission statement, actually. Opportunities to grow for all Singaporean youth. And so we think about access and making sure that all segments of youth at least have that access and the option to grow at some point, whether they take it earlier or later. Under the National Youth Council, we have the Youth Core. We also have Outward Bound Singapore. Obviously, they run different programs, but again, they add to the scale of opportunities. So that's just a very quick gist of what we do and what I would like the National Youth Council to be doing for young people.
That's great.
Well, can I go on or go ahead?
Yeah, definitely. Well, firstly, thanks, David. I think that's a great introduction to give context to a lot of folks that are tuning in as to what NYC and the National Youth Council actually covers, right? I think I think in this segment, given that it's a mental festival, we're going to scope in a bit more towards how you see youth mental well-being, youth mental health. But I think beyond just that, from the remit and what NYC looks after, it's different pillars of a youth's life, right? I think overall you mentioned opportunities, and I want to just zoom in into how you guys actually segmented 15-35. I think you shared this before with me, where these are, especially between the 19-24, these are the transitioning life phases where a young individual becomes a young adult, right? And where they may change from being a student towards being an adult. So maybe you could expand a bit more into how individually as a CEO of NYC, or from a purview of NYC as a ministry or as your own organization, how you guys view the different phases of individuals in their life, from when they're in secondary school to tertiary, and then when they graduate after as well.
It's a good question. I mean, it's a good point to make. So when we look at the segments of young people, we look at 15 to 18, and we segment that because they belong in a structured schooling system. And then we look at 19 to 24, because that's where in the Singapore context, the younger person goes into a less, it's still a structured schooling system, but there's a lot more space for learning experiences and trying different things in the tertiary institutions. And at this stage, their social maturity levels are also a little higher and more complex. There's a bit more openness to learning, to trying new things. And so this is a key transition stage where there are opportunities for shaping and seeding some things. And then you have the 25 to 35. It's a different ballgame there, because that's where reality bites in Singapore, and jobs, housing, starting families start to come in, which means that the space for self-discovery begins to shrink a little while they embrace the adult responsibilities. And that's a tension point. So when we look at these three age segments, then we think about the key transition issues and the drivers for what causes growth and what causes stress. So in the early age range, the first bucket, the drivers for growth are within a more structured Ministry of Education system, where the change agents are usually in the school, some peers, and as well as the family. And it's delivered in a more systemic way, and they tend to be guided more. The drivers of stress are basically purely academics, and that's born in our National Youth Survey that we've done over the last 15 years. The primary driver of stress in the early age range are academic studies. In the 19 to 24 age range, though, the opportunities of growth are different, and the drivers of stress there are about uncertainty about what the future holds for them. So academic studies contribute to that aspect as well, but they're looking a lot more ahead about what's next for me, what careers, what are my life goals, and there's a lot of uncertainty there. And some people say it's adulting. I think that's part of it. But the drivers for stress are future uncertainty as a bucket over many things. beyond the 25 age range, it's still future uncertainty, but the texture is different. The drivers are the realities of life and what they are expected to do and achieve and acquire. So these are the reasons how and why we choose to look at it in this ways. And if you think about it that way, then it informs the way you look at the problems in each segment, and maybe the levers that you will then choose to employ in these 8 segments. So for those of you who are in the early schooling stages, the kinds of partners you work with may be different. How you approach the issue may be different. How you deliver the service will be different. And then as you go into the 19 to 24 stage, similar challenges and so on and so forth. And in the 25 onwards, the added angle is employers, how to work with employers and the workplaces. So that's briefly how that segmentation helps us in thinking about the transitory drivers of stress and how that contributes to mental well-being.
Yeah, it's a very, very clear and insightful way to look at it. Because what I can share is, and like ourselves, we look at it from demographics of 8 ranges. But I think what you bring and what you share, it's really unique in how you see it as stages of life as well, right? So just echoing what you said, there are 3 broad segments that you guys bucket within. The more younger folks that are 15 to 19, is that right? And then 19 to 24, those that are in university, already having some semblance of maybe doing part-time work, maybe thinking about the future, and then folks that go into the kind of the real world, right, working 25 to 35. And touching on the points of levers, I know from one of the chats that we had ourselves, you also touched on a good point whereby each stage has different ways we can reach them, right? The younger audience, people that are in the 15 to 19, you have like an ecosystem of the education, the MOE to actually address and support them with like school counselors, different programs in place there. But as they journey further up and up, once they go into the career world, it's really hard to reel them back and provide support because it's just a lot more open. There's no grounding factor. So that's a very interesting point that I'll dig in a bit more later with you. But I think towards the theme of the session today, right? So there is many facets towards youth, right, and what you guys cover, but towards mental health itself, how do you see this? And I'm sure it's become a lot more of a top of mind topic for you guys as well, in the past year and a half as well. How do you guys see mental health, mental well-being in a general view? And how do you see that changing? A fairly broad question, and I'll dig a bit more into it later.
Okay, so you see my background, I've got some pointers there for you guys.
Very cool, very nice.
So even as I talked about the segments, there are some common trends across all segments. And at the broad landscape view, as we talk to our counterparts in the rest of government, whether it's the Ministry of Education, MOH, IMH, and various other agencies, we do know that there's an increased demand for mental health services across the board. So if we just take, for example, SOS youth clients, it's gone from something like 19% in 2016 to about 26% as of last year. Chat, which has a location in Scape, has 34 times more referrals in the age 16 to 30 band. And that's up from 2010 to 2019. 34 times more referrals. Not all the referrals make it to completed assessments. About half of it makes it to completed assessment. But of that half, almost 3/4 have mood disorders as the most common diagnosis. So if you think also about it, while it is a peak or increasing demand, we also ask ourselves the questions, what are most of the cases about? And most of the cases center around mood disorders, general depressive disorders. And not all of them actually require clinical treatment. In fact, many of them may not. And the interventions are not always clinical. So that's the most common diagnosis. We've also noted in our other survey instruments, and I mentioned the National Youth Survey is one, we also have a longitudinal survey that we started in 2017 that tracks about 3,000 to 4,000 youth for the next 6 years. So it's not ended yet. And in the latest wave in 2021, it bears out still that uncertainty about employment or career prospects are positively correlated with depression and anxiety level. And this is in the Singapore context. So of course, it bears out that our narrative of success and how we define success for the young people has a big bearing on their state of mental well-being. And we also noted that youth transiting or remaining in unemployment report the highest level of depression and anxiety. So I think we have to admit that in the Singapore context, the linkage to jobs and employment, in particular full-time employment, is a big factor in their overall state of well-being. Is this the desired state? Obviously, no. We do not want your definition of yourself to be just centered around a job. But the reality is this. So until we reverse what that notion of success looks like, this is the current reality. The other thing we have also started to notice that parents, employers, and youth workers are starting to ask for more help and resources. And I think while different groups are trying to marshal the resources and aggregate them in places for better access, it's still rather fragmented. And so parents like me are always asking, what's the most credible literature on how to tell me about what the effects of gaming are for my kid, who spends a hell lot of time gaming, but they're doing other things as well. So the question for me also is how much is enough? Is there what's good gaming and what's not? Who has the literature on what games are suitable? And a lot of it's, again, parental self-discovery, or we share amongst ourselves. I'm not even sure if it's misinformation amongst ourselves, right? But we do know that parents, employers, and youth are starting to ask for these things. So I think there's a recognition that we need good resources made available. The third thing is we also do know that stigma continues to be an issue. We are Asian, so I think we do have to admit that there are certain sensitivities that we still carry. It's improving, and I think amongst the younger population, we do detect that they're a little more open about it, but predominantly by and large, we still dance around it. And so whatever levers that we choose to exercise cannot ignore the fact that this remains an issue. We can't just call for openness and it will happen. It doesn't happen like that. So when we think again of delivery of services and we keep pushing for sharing of information between the clinic to the school, to the service provider, you have to remain sensitive that not everybody wants it that way. And you think about the client and the person that's involved, you have to think about how they feel about this. The fourth one I want to highlight is something I think we have underexploited, and that's the family. And so I'm happy that parents are asking for resources because, like it or not, the family has a huge bearing on the mental well-being of the child in both negative and positive ways. So in MOH and IMH, they already know that adverse childhood experiences are associated with increased odds of mental health conditions. That's almost a proven study now. But we also know that in our youth survey, that the number one top priority for young people across the years, since we conducted the survey, is family relationships, which means that a young person attaches a huge importance to what the family says, whether you explicitly say it or you don't say it, whether you communicate those expectations or not. By your actions and by your behaviors and what goes on at the dinner table, you have a bearing on the choices of young people, and you have a bearing on how they think about what success looks like and what's acceptable and what is expected of me. there are a lot of factors going on inside there. And so we do need to exploit the family effect a lot more. Don't just depend on the educators and the service providers. The family is probably a high dividend potential. So educating parents is a difficult thing to do, but it's something to think about there. The last one I wanted to mention was the parallel online world. Today, the young people live in dual worlds. So there is a physical personality, and they have also got an online persona, as well as routines, habits, and behaviors. And the more that they are straddling these two worlds, we just have to recognize that there are influences that have a bearing also on the young. So it's not just simply the cumulative effects of how much time they spend online and what they do there. It's also what personas and influences they are being subjected to as they go online. And so we are worried about things like cyberbullying, online harassment, sexual content or image-based sexual abuse, cyber threats. These all have a factor also on the overall well-being. So while you address the physical aspects, just know that there's a parallel world that's also exerting a long hand into the state of mental well-being. So I just thought, Theo, I would state some of the current state trends that affect all age segments wherever you are.
I think it's a great point. I really like the way that you actually put the bullet points on. I haven't seen the way that we've done this before. This is a super good way to do it. But I think beyond that, really good points you've raised up, right? I think all of these are this 5 points. 5 points are very clear. I think, as you said, each stand out in its own way as well, right? So I think you've highlighted some key things that I want to just touch on a bit briefly. So just to kind of cover, you mentioned that youth today, a big part of what you guys found was that mood disorders were one of the most common struggles that the youth today face. And that's an interesting point that I think is a byproduct of actually the stresses of what things are. And then you're saying as well that, just connecting the dots, parents, employers for the older youth, right, the more mature youth, as well as youth workers, are now requesting more support, probably triggered by the onset of COVID. A lot of people are locked down, cooped up, different stresses. I think that is one thing, but I think what's great that's been happening is it's not just us, but there's been a whole wave of further push on mental health awareness in Singapore and in public as well, right? So different movements, different organizations pushing the agenda, which is great. I think that double push from COVID as well as organizations pushing the narrative does help. But to the point that stigma still exists, right? So a few things in place I want to get your thoughts on. A big part of what you mentioned that stood out to me, and I agree with this, and I believe a lot of Singaporeans that are on this session agree with it. What actually Singapore has put in place in a good way, right? We are a very thriving economy, but also what we perceive as success as good. It's a big part of actually what drives a lot of stress for the kids these days, for me, for all of us, right? We are always driven towards needing to actually excel, it's a boon and a bane, because it helps us excel. Nowhere else in the world has a country gone from a small fishing village towards a first world city in such a short span of time. Because that's something that has happened. But how do you see this, right, in the sense whereby education is a big part of what parents and kids care about today, all the way towards the kids these days also care about how they do. Definitely influenced by their parents and surroundings, but they themselves care about this. What are some points that you think that, I think high level, just kind of off the cuff, right? Like, how do you see this trend happening? What do you recommend that parents, students, people tuning in can think about in balancing this undeniable, but very relevant drive to actually excel? Yeah.
Okay, I'm glad you asked that. So I'm just going to jump very quickly then to, so I'm not going, I put 3 A's here, but to your question, I'm going to touch on the last one, the anti-fragile mindset. So when we all work together here, I think to address some of the gaps we talked about, availability of services, ensuring that there are sufficient services, not just in the schools, but in the workplaces, and actually in the community. So if you think of it as safety nets, school is just one safety net and one option for help. workplaces another. But the community is one space that we can exploit a lot more. And it gives options for anonymity, going to different service providers for customized needs. We probably have to think about access in terms of awareness of where to navigate for resources and services, what's affordable, and improve the wayfinding. So access to good quality care and services is important. But the last one speaks to what you asked. And we also ask ourselves at NYCU, how do we see our work helping this? And how could parents help? But it's difficult to just for the parent to tell the child success can look different. From 2 points. One is it's easy to say, but then also when they start to look at your yearbooks of mommy and daddy, and they listen into some of the conversations between you and other parents, walking the talk is tough, and they will see actually what actually matters to my parents. Oh, it's actually this. They said this, but so our everyday actions betray what that notion of success looks like. And it's not just from parents, it's what employers also say and what society at large says. I don't really know how to overcome that other than just keep nagging the point. But maybe there's something about what we can do in terms of helping the child or the young person develop an anti-fragile mindset. I borrowed this from one of my favorite authors, and this is more personal, from Nassim Taleb, who looked at building anti-fragile systems. And I think it speaks to some of the work that we do. And I want to go into a bit more specifics about how NYC thinks about building this. And it actually relates to what the earlier speaker, Robert, talked about. Right? He talked about the continuing to learn. The idea behind learning is growing. And the idea behind growing is that you have to subject yourself to discomfort. In Outward Bound, my instructors will tell me that they deliberately subject the students to uncertainty with pure evil intent. So the student will ask for, can I have a timetable for the next 3 days? And the instructor will say, no. We will tell you when the time comes. When a dispute breaks out in the watch, the instructor does not intervene. They allow students to go through a challenge and they let them sort it out. And the same is true for maybe some of our programs where we see a commonality with overseas programs. Why do we like overseas programs so much? It's not because of that tour you do at the end. I mean, that's part of it too. It's because you're out of this safety bubble called Singapore. You're in unfamiliar ground, terrain. You don't know the people. You don't even know their needs. You thought you knew their needs, but you go there and you find that your plans are thrown out the window. So the idea of exposure and challenge and discomfort and then being forced to relearn and review your assumptions is an important part of growth. And I think even as we go through COVID and as we allow young people to go through stresses, we should be careful in not completely taking away the discomfort and making it too safe. Because you need to allow for these bounds of growth to build that resilience so that when the next bigger crisis comes, they are in a better position to address it. So the exposure and the challenge to learn to cope with these things is important. And I don't have all the opportunities. All of us collectively, we need to inject these opportunities over a time period. So the schools, I hope, will do that. In the 19 to 24 age range, I hope that both the schools, the tertiary institutions, as well as community partners, and even government will challenge our young people to grow. And then the workplaces, similarly. The next thing to consider is social capital. And in our research too, we do know that overall state of well-being and life satisfaction are a lot higher when the young people have had healthy social capital and networks built up in the earlier years, whether it's in school, in the extracurricular activities, or in interest groups, or in community groups, whichever, even in the workplace groups. These
David,
bonds
to define social capital for those tuning in, as what is
okay.
term referred to? Yeah.
Well, it's simply as stated: social bonds, relationships, networks. Yeah, and we find that these are the networks that usually will shore up a person when the person goes through crisis, goes through difficult trials. They are also a sounding board. The corollary is what you all think about in terms of peer supporters. So actually, in the first instance, if somebody is going through a mood disorder, the best first recourse is to go to a known community or network of friends. And then if that doesn't work out, then maybe the peer supporter or that other support system that a service provider can give. But in the first instance, that ought to be the first safety net, if the family safety net is not working. So social bonds and relationships to be cultivated intentionally is important. So the trend that we worry about over the last 2 years is that as we shrink the number of social participation activities for young people in schools and across community, we think there will be a dent in the social bonding, and we wonder what the long-term effects could be, and we're not thrilled about it. So which means that as we try and improve the mental well-being landscape, we also have to think about intentionality in allowing for activities and pushing the boundaries of some of these measures to allow for social bonding. Full stop. I think we have to try. The last one is what we have started to discover as we subject our young people to exposure and challenge. Inadvertently, there is a final part of them that's asking for what's the purpose of all this? And I refer to these as core anchors. And you can call it purpose in life, you can call it faith-based values, you can call it a set of core values. But these anchors are important because we've noticed, for example, youth from religious organizations tend to hold out for crisis better, and their social bonds are also stronger. It's because there's a central belief or an anchor on something that helps them to overcome a challenge or exposure. So you know that you hear stories about how people have overcome cancer and debilitating crisis, whether it's financial or otherwise. For the person without a core anchor, it's harder. And so they become almost heroic for those who have. It's like, how did the person do this? And sometimes when you look at it, the person doesn't have a lot of friends, maybe sometimes enough friends. But what drove the person to overcome it was a core belief or core system, whether it's in a God or it's in a certain set of values or something that a purpose that he or she follows. So in your journey of working with the young people, help them to discover these core anchors. Don't just grow their skills and competencies, but help them to find that anchor that may help them and may help them actually address some of these mental well-being conditions. And so our work has also branched out into coaching and mentoring, because we believe that sometimes in a journey of trying to discover your core anchor and your core beliefs, having that adult journey with you and help discover that is useful. So for those of you who are in a coaching and a mentoring and counseling space, this is another dimension of building an anti-fragile mindset. So for parents, for educators, for those of us who work in the sector, or those of us who work with young people, whether you're out there designing experiences that challenge them, or whether you're out there designing a social participation opportunity, or whether you're coaching or mentoring, these are ways that we can collectively help to shore up their mental well-being strength. And so I think that's the needle that we can shift from a different perspective, as opposed to just going to the clinical and service delivery aspects, which are still important to ensure availability and access. But this is the longer term work that probably needs to be done by us all.
I think it's a good point. I think this is super insightful. I must say it's very relatable hearing you share, David, because I think a lot of things you touched on are things that as a person who has been born and raised in Singapore, I've gone through OBS, I've gone through different things, and it's all relatable. I was going to say, I'll add a few points, but I think this whole point of building anti-fragility relates to the point of being proactive and preventative in an individual's mental well-being, right? Like you said, exposing them to certain, manageable challenges so they're not too sheltered, helping them build good enough social pillars around them, their friends, their family. I think it's just kind of probably at a point, and I'm sure you agree, it's not so much about quantity, but the quality of the connections you have around you as well. I think the third thing is the anchors, right? I think it's a good point that having something that grounds you does help. So I was just going to add a point towards the first bullet point you have there, exposure and challenges. Just to share, I was saying I've been through OBS myself when I was in, I think, P5 primary school, right? That's when it actually happens, right? Yeah, I think probably a bit different now, probably from what it was then, but it definitely was a different experience from what I have gone through in my day-to-day Singaporean student life in itself. And one example I'll share that I think really highlights something that as Singaporeans, and for those that are not from Singapore, I think still relates anyway, but what we take for granted in all our lives is what we have in place as well, right? Singapore is a very safe place. There's all things that it's laid out for us. We want to transport, we take the bus, MRT, we want to do this, that it's there. And one of the points that I heard from my peers, right, not just one, but a couple of them that aren't from Asia, came from Europe, came from US, and they shared that when they came to Singapore and lived here as expats, it felt like a very artificially engineered safe surrounding, and so much so safe that it felt engineered, which I found was a very, very interesting example that as someone that's been born and raised here, I take that for granted. It's a good thing, but at the same time, as you pointed out, it's helpful as well to have parents and people that work with youth to actually try exposing them to manageable challenges that gives them experiences to actually be more, I'll say, durable in a sense, right? As an individual, when things happen, when you go into the working world, things will happen inevitably, right? But you can actually tackle it if you will have the solutions, but I think the fact is, so long as you've been exposed to it, you are able to regulate these things because you felt these emotions before, right? Don't know what to do, stuff like that. I think that's a good point, and I think that's one that for whether you are youth or students, whether you are people that work with kids, whether you're a parent or someone that works with youth, it's a good point to note that exposure is not a bad thing. I think it's probably pretty good, right? In moderation as to how can you get people more experiences to do with things. So that's really, really insightful. I'm mindful of time. We've got about 5-6 more minutes. Time flies. There's quite a lot of questions that have come in. I want to cover, two quick points. I'm picking out ones that I think stand out to me. So one, it's that from the National Youth Council's perspective, currently right now, what are things that you guys do to actually help tackle youth mental health? And this is one that I know myself, you shared with me. You guys have like a youth core, you guys have like a peer mentoring, things that are not just top-down initiatives, but also bottom-up stuff that really drives to set that community in place. Maybe you could share a bit more about what you guys do here.
Okay, we don't do it alone. So there is an interagency mental well-being task force. And I know that Singapore is fond of task forces, but the fact of the matter is that you do need multiple hands in this. And so the task force involves schools, the social ministries, the health ministry, as well as us. Because again, if you look at the whole issue, It isn't just about making sure that we have quality mental well-being services delivered in a timely way, in a sensible way, uh, or customized to needs. You do have to tackle the physical aspects of health, sports. You do have to tackle the aspects of making sure that people are forming networks and have the opportunity to do so. And the agencies that are doing this are consciously doing it and not drying up these things. You have to look at opportunities to get our young people out of Singapore, to get a lot more exposure. So the biggest shift I think we want to make is that we don't want to do it just by ourselves as government. And in time, I hope that there's a lot more space released to community partners, employers, and people like yourselves to come in to actually design some of the solutions. I don't think we are completely ready yet because we're still trying to figure the enormity of the task. But I think once the aspects of the different dimensions of the problem become clearer, then actually we will need to come to the citizens for solutioning. And not just solutioning, but for expert views in the design. Yeah. So that's the hope. And for those of you who are out here that are trying to get into partnerships with the government, I ask for patience first, because in truth, we're also trying to figure out our different roles. When I sit in a task force, I'm also trying to understand where I value add and fit in, so that we don't duplicate and we don't overdo things. And more importantly, we don't solve and leave nothing for you all to solve. And that's not the idea. Yeah. So that's just why I thought I would just put it out there, Theo. Yeah.
That's a great point. I must share that what is always very, very, like, I'll say, refreshing for me when I speak with you is that you provide a very, very real perspective from a ministry level, from a government level, from a public sector level, that how you guys actually tackling this. And the fact of the matter is that there is no clear silver bullet in place, right? The truth is that there are things that need to be put in place from the government level, from the education level, and even from our individual and common level that needs to actually tackle this, because no one size fits all. I think there's different parts actually to tackle this. And what's very, I'll say, heartening to me, it's that with you at the helm of NYC, and what you guys are already doing, it seems that a lot of the right stuff are being put in place, right? It's not a short game, like short-term plan that you have in place, but what will actually help, as the title of the session is, right, build the foundations for the long run for the youth to succeed, not just in mental health, but in different aspects of life. But I think very, very relevant today, it's their mental health in itself. So I think that's super helpful to know. I know there are a lot of questions that have come in. We will do our best. We can't answer all of it today. I think, David, you've done a great job to really keep everyone engaged. The attendees fees has only gone up since we started the session. So we will be collating all of these questions, and ourselves will be getting back on this to do the those who actually came on board. But we are times up for this particular session. David, it's really, really helpful. I honestly believe a lot of us tuning in has benefited from, whether they are youth themselves or whether they are actually parents or people that work with youth, different snippets that actually apply to them. So thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to actually share with us on this session. And it really does help, I think, share perspective as to how, from your lens at NYC, you guys see it as well. So thank you so much for joining the session.
It's a pleasure. Thank you all as well for being part of this effort.
Perfect. Right, I'll let you run, David. Thank you so much. Appreciate you coming in, and do reach out to NYC. You guys have, I think they run a lot of great initiatives. Do look up their website. I think it's the Google National Youth Council. They have like a youth call. They have like, you're looking for people to support in the peer support network. David, is there any final quick shout outs that you want to give for folks tuning in, that if they want to participate?
Also check out Utopia. There's a bunch of resources there and ways to access. Thanks.
Perfect. Thanks, David. Have a good one. See you. Bye-bye.